I know that you had questions to dive deeper with Dr. Tabor. And of course, again, shameless plug, James has a course on reading the Gospel of Mark as the Gospel of Mark. And he emphasizes and goes into a lot of really interesting things in Mark that you don't find in Matthew and that are really almost shocking for those who've never actually considered.
Let me just add this on that point. Derek, we had 40 people sign up for Mark. Just your wife sent me the new names just recently. And we're not even pushing it. That was months ago, right? Last year. And now we're doing Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there's still such an interest. And I believe this program is going to cause a lot of people to sign up, maybe hundreds, who knows? It very well could. So it's going out everywhere, and I'm going to put it on my channel as well. And here's the thing, because we have right now, I meet on Zoom with whoever is currently in the course I'm teaching. So it's Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And at the end of the month on Saturday, the 30th, if you sign up for Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can come to the Zoom meeting. You can hear it even if you can't come, because we record it and upload it as part of the course. But because I see this surge of interest, Derek, and you call me and ask me about doing this because of the riding the two donkeys that we can get into in a minute, which is a similar kind of thing that Matthew does. So I'm going to plan in April a special kind of reunion Zoom meeting for the old Mark students, the ones that have been with me for months, and invite all the new ones. And it doesn't matter when you sign up, you do it online. Same with Kipp's courses. You can start tomorrow, you can start next week, you can start, at 4:00 today or 4:30 when we get off. You can start anywhere. It doesn't matter. You work at your own pace. A lot of times people think when they talk about an online course, well, what are the dates? And, I don't want to be behind. You won't be behind. You're never behind. Nobody's ever behind. So what am I going to do in the Zoom meeting in April? Just for Mark students, it's going to be a special. I'm trying to get the Dead Sea Scroll students and Kipp students to also sign up for Mark. That's what we're doing right now. So what am I going to do? Well, it's a secret. I'm going to do something so cool. Here's a hint. It involves Morton Smith. Okay. I'm going to set you straight on Morton Smith and the secret gospel. So
I just read an article about that.
I did too. Was it in the Atlantic or the
Pacific? It's in the Atlantic. Yeah. It's
Atlantic
Ariel Savar, my friend
Mediterranean magazine. So, yeah. Okay. So thanks for
very interesting.
And you're going to put the link to the course. Yeah.
I'll put it out there now. Kipp, go ahead and take us into some of the controversies, questions.
Yeah, for sure. So, now I think I got pulled into this. Thanks, Derek, because he's got donkeys on the brain right now. Right. And I did a long stream about what Matthew is doing with the story in Mark about his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. But this just, like, going through that, I think it raises so many interesting questions about what on earth Matthew thinks he's doing in the first place, and why he's doing it. And one of the things that apologists always want to convince us of is that all four of these writers, whoever they were, who wrote Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, they were just in lockstep with one another, right? So in places where they may say things differently, it's not because they had different ideas about what was going on. No. It's just, there was always two donkeys in that story. It's just that Mark and Luke and John chose not to mention one of them, but there were always two there. So I'm always just really intrigued by and I think this is scholarship, right? As scholars, we look at a text and we're looking at the comparative literature, and we're going, whoa, hold on, that's different. Why is that different? What's going on here? What can we say about what Matthew's doing.
So we're
when
actually trying to understand, not destroy. This idea, oh,
Yeah.
you're just trying to destroy. No, if you try to mush it all together, you are
That's gonna wreck it.
destroying. Because you're going to say,
Yeah.
well, first of all, the most donkeys will always win. If we had another
The
gospel,
most angels will
let's
always
say the
win. Yeah.
lost Gospel of Peter, because we don't have this part of it. But let's say we had the triumph entry, and he said there were 4 donkeys and 5 disciples rode them. Well, then you'd have to put that in too. That's not the way you read. You read Matthew as Matthew, Mark as Mark, Luke as Luke, and you try to ask what Kipp just said. And you actually have to look at the whole thing, like I do in the Mark
Yeah.
course, or if I taught a Matthew course or so forth. And that is, what is their overall purpose? And I can tell you Matthew's right now. It's very simple. Guess what? It's the last verse. All authority and power belongs to Jesus Christ in heaven and on earth. And the mission of the church, he's the only gospel that uses church, the word church, ecclesia, twice. The mission of the church is to go and teach and baptize and make disciples until the end of the age. That's Matthew. That's not Mark. So that's not Mark's purpose.
Yeah.
Mark's purpose is to say, this whole Jesus thing is very mysterious. And I'm going to let you, the reader, in on the secret teachings of Jesus that he only gave to his disciples. They never got it, not one single time. They're never praised, not one single time. Okay, never. What did Jesus say in Matthew? He praised it. Oh, blessed Peter, you're blessed. What great understanding. Well, how could it be great understanding if he calls him Satan and says, get behind me? I mean, come on. So you say, well, I could put all those together and get both. Well, then if you don't care about losing Mark, because Mark is very precious. You know what Mark does for you that Matthew doesn't do? He lets you figure it out. I'll tell you my favorite is after the transfiguration in Mark 9, the disciples go like, again, clueless. Wait. How could we be? This is the kingdom of God, the glory, Moses, Elijah on the mountain. That's what we're wanting to come right now. And it was a vision. They said, so let's go to Jerusalem and take over. And they said, but what about Elijah? Elijah's got to come. This is a prophecy in Malachi, the very last chapters of Malachi.
Yeah.
And he goes, Elijah already came, and they did to him what was written of him. Now, many people figure that's John the Baptist, and I think it is. But Mark doesn't tell you it's John the Baptist. You see what happens? You go, so here's Matthew. He does this all the time. It's John the Baptist.
Yeah.
You dummies. It's John. He does it again. Here's my favorite. This is like when you forget scriptures. Like, I think it's in Isaiah or maybe Jeremiah. Oh, maybe Hosea. He quotes Daniel. In Mark 13, he alludes to Daniel, but he doesn't say Daniel. He says, as it is written, the desolating sacrilege will stand in the holy place. Let the reader understand. Reader of what? The Bible, the prophets. Where should I read? Should I start in Genesis 1:1? You know what Matthew does? He goes, as prophesied by the prophet Daniel. See how he helps out the reader? Now, there's nothing wrong with helping out the reader, except Mark doesn't want to help you out. He wants you to read it and you get all the explanations. You're supposed to figure it out. And then when you come to the last chapter, which I bet I surprised some of you, thought, Tabor's going to do Mark 16 and claim that was the original ending. Well, we could do that. But, I thought I would surprise you and do some things maybe you haven't looked at, because that's the one that's usually talked about. He doesn't have a birth story and he doesn't have resurrection appearances. That's true. And if you add them, you've lost. But you know what you've got to figure out when you read Mark? Why would he end it like that? He clearly believes Jesus was raised. And he even believes there are appearances, because he says, the guy in the tomb says, you will see him in the Galilee. So he's writing for a faith community that believes the faith was recovered in the Galilee. Luke has a real problem with that, because he does not want them even going to the Galilee. And in fact says in Luke and in Acts, do not leave Jerusalem until Shavuot or Pentecost. Well, if they don't leave until the 50 days later, obviously they're not going to see him in Galilee. unless they're going to have, telepathic vision or something.
Obviously.
So clearly, you see what happens when you do this? It does not destroy the text to respect them and read them carefully. So their purposes are different. Luke's purpose is totally different. Also, you can always find out the purpose at the end of every book. Look at the last verse. It's funny. This is what ancient books do. They kind of tell you their purpose at the end. So Matthew, Jesus' authority, power is with us. We're the church. We're preaching until he comes. So he doesn't care how long it takes, delay of the parousia, as we call it. He doesn't care. I'm with you till the end of the age. Say, how long is that? Till the end of the age. Could it be 2,000 years? Yeah, and it can also be 10,000 years. Still read that verse. What do you need to do? Preach, baptize, teach. What does Mark say?
Yeah.
Run from the tomb and be scared. I could be vulgar here, but just be scared senseless. Use another S word, because you have no idea the awesomeness of what has just happened. And Luke is more like, okay, you guys, you need to start in Samaria, in Judea, and then up to Antioch, and then go into Greece and to the ends of the world, and finally Rome. And that's, he's got a completely different idea to kind of Romanize and normalize it for the Mediterranean culture. And they're all different. I love the differences. And you know what? James Dunn is one of the great evangelical scholars, passed away a few years ago, good friend of mine. And we disagreed like crazy. You should see how he reviewed my Paul book. And I responded to him. It was in Bar Magazine. You can look it up, or look on my blog, because I reproduce it, jamestabor.com. But he, to his credit, said exactly what I'm saying. He's a believing Christian, and he said, you guys quit destroying the text. Nowhere in the New Testament is Jesus made God. That was James Dunn. He said, well, he couldn't be evangelical. Yes, he was. He's talking about the one God, the Father, the Lord, Yod He Vav He. And he also says, read the Gospels critically, because don't you want to get the original meaning? That should be the desire of any careful reader of the Bible, believer and unbeliever. You do it with every other book. We don't slop all the things together. Imagine taking three biographies of Lincoln, merging them all together, that and then what are you going to publish that as your own work? Because you've just created something that none of those authors created. Maybe one author doesn't like Lincoln, and maybe another author idolizes him. We do have those biographies.
So it becomes an incoherent work then. At that point. And it's a great point. I think it's a great point that you make about finding the meaning of a writing by carefully investigating how it ends. And this probably is also just like one of these great big, flashing clues to us, where we see so many of these ancient works, they end up being appended. A whole new ending is added to the Gospel of Mark. Why? Because the first one doesn't work. You see it with the with the Hebrew scriptures too. You've got a whole new revised version of Jeremiah that ends completely differently than the Septuagint version. Because why? They need to change the meaning of the book. You see this in really troubling theodicies, like in the book of Job. Or in the book of Ecclesiastes. You've got to fix the text, and the way you fix the text is to re-end them.
You're going to get so much more out of Job, say, as a great example. If you will get a good study Bible, I would recommend the Jewish Study Bible or the New Oxford Annotated RSV Study Bible, and read the notes and just consider them. And I think you're going to come away not thinking, oh, they're just tearing up the text, they don't really believe it. You're going to come away with some great insights in terms of even the problem of suffering. Because if you read the more original parts of it, it has a completely different answer to why Job suffered.
Totally different.
And it's actually the answer that most of us live with every day when we think about theodicy and justice and what's the cosmos and what does it mean. it's a struggle. And essentially, we're silent before the vastness of the question. And other times, just jumping into Kipp's field, which is more Hebrew Bible, we're both Bible scholars, so we overlap. Bart always says, I can teach Hebrew Bible. I'm a Bible scholar. Well, I'm a Bible scholar too. I study with major people at Chicago in Hebrew Bible, like Gustav Ahlstrom, but, read Hebrew with him and so forth. One of my favorites is Isaiah 56, where the author is getting very worried that this house of prayer for all peoples is going to get a little bit generic. And I'm not even sure we need the temple. And Jeremiah says it's a den of shredders or ripping animals apart. You've turned it into slaughterhouse, basically, he says. And so what does somebody add? And it's so obvious. Read Isaiah 56. They go, and your burnt offerings will then be acceptable. Wait, okay. I see. Okay. And Psalm 51, everybody knows that. It's David's prayer of repentance when he murders Uriah the Hittite and commits adultery with Bathsheba. And he has this wonderful prayer, have mercy on me, O God. Many people can quote it. It's very moving, very touching, prayer of repentance. And at the end, he says, I could bring sacrifices, but that wouldn't mean anything. And da da da. And then the last someone at the end put, build the walls of Jerusalem. After the build the walls of Jerusalem, and then we will offer sacrifices. Like, don't read this and think that God doesn't want sacrifice, even though he says he doesn't, like in different prophetic passages. Yeah. So you need to let, I grew up in the Church of Christ, and let me give you a new phrase. This came from the Radical Reformation. You'll all know it. Speak where the Bible speaks. Remain silent where the Bible is silent. Okay? Remember that. What we just said. You say, well, I'm going to mush it all together. Well, then you're not remaining silent. Read Mark and remain silent. If Mark doesn't have it, read Mark. Speak where the Bible speaks. Speak where Mark speaks. Speak where Matthew speaks. You see? That is a conservative position. I'm sorry. I define liberal as sloppy, loose, doesn't really matter. Who cares about details? That's how we use the idea of liberal often. You're being kind of liberal with this idea. What about being more careful? And so I'm going to call all my conservative friends liberals. No, they're not. You got to respect the text. You think Mark doesn't know of appearances? Of course he knows of appearances. He chooses not to tell them. Have you ever wondered why? Instead of fixing him, you're going to fix Mark. I don't like it ending like that. Well, you weren't the author, were you? So why does it matter whether you like it? Because you're taking a different purpose than he had and putting that purpose on top of him. And that's why I call my course, Creating Jesus, Why Mark's Gospel Was Forgotten. You say, well, it's not forgotten. You just went over it, Dr. Tabor. Yeah, but what's the part people remember? Blessed are you, Peter. They couldn't tell you if it was Matthew, Mark, or Luke. But if you say, what did Jesus say to Peter when he finally confessed him and had this great insight? Find somebody that's going to, he called him Satan and said to get away from him. Nobody's going to say that. They're going to say he blessed him and he made him the head of all the apostles, right? So.
Nice.
Zero in on this because I know we only have James for like 40 minutes.
Yeah. All right. So there's a couple
you
things.
Jump in too, Derek. You jump in too. But go ahead, Kipp. Sorry.
There was a couple things that I wanted to sort of take a closer look at some of your examples there, and I think the first one is the story of John the Baptist, the beheading of John the Baptist.
That's number one. Let's put that up again.
Is that number one? So, and because as I read this,
not the baptism, but the death. You mean the death of John? Yeah,
the death of John the Baptist.
He'll put that.
I should have been clearer about that, shouldn't I? Sorry. Right. So as I read this, I'm looking at a lot of the stuff that Matthew's leaving out here, and I'm wondering if you think or what you think about some of this, because one of the things that struck me was this part here in Mark, like this part here in Mark 6:20.
Mhm.
Well, starting at 19, Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and a
Oh,
holy
yeah.
man, that
Mhm.
he he kept, and it says there, he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was very much perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly.
Mhm.
And Matthew just doesn't want to have anything to
Oh, no.
do with that, does he?
That's a huge
Yeah,
problem.
talk about that. Talk about why Matthew doesn't
He
want.
thought John was a holy and righteous man. Herod Antipas? Are you kidding me? He killed him. Well, Mark's giving you the story there. Mhm.
Yeah. So there's definitely, like, there's always, I tend to think like there's often a polemic at work here behind a lot
Mhm.
of these texts, where the writer of Matthew, it seems to me, is just, you know, we've got to
Yeah.
we've got to make Herod as reprehensible as we can in this story.
Sometimes when he shortens things, another example is this story about healing the paralyzed guy in Mark. We won't put it up, it doesn't matter. But everybody remembers the story. They can't get in, it's so crowded. They
Mhm.
take the roof off, they let the guy down. This will be good for our listeners and viewers to do. Go find that in Matthew. I'm not even going to tell you where it is. I know where it is, but I want you to go find it. Just thumb through and find the paralytic and read it, because you're going to be surprised. See, people have this stuff in their heads, like I did, if you
Mhm.
grew up with it, and all of you three did too. You just got the stories in your head. So you don't know if it's Matthew, Mark, or Luke. If I go, what's that story about the paralytic? Like Kipp was like nodding his head. Yeah, I know the one you mean. But the version they have in their head is a composite, generally,
Yeah, it
of
is.
everything. And it tends to be the fullest story, which in this case is also Mark. And so Mark tends to do things that you don't need to do if you're telling a story. For example, don't go there again, but why does Herodias need to talk to her daughter, then her daughter go back and talk to uh, Herodias, talk to Herod, and then talk to her daughter, then her daughter talked to Herod? And so why do you need all that? Just
Mhm.
say, if you look at what Matthew did, he just said, don't go through all that. Just say she
Yeah.
asked for the head. Okay. So you could say, well, Mark's being fuller and more dramatic, but a lot of times it's not just fuller and more dramatic, it's to change the point. So with the paralytic, guess what? He strips it down to nothing. 4 men brought a paralyzed guy to Jesus, and he said, my son, your sins be forgiven. How can he forgive sins? Only God can do that. He goes, oh, you didn't think I should do that? Here, rise and walk. Matthew's only interest in that is, what did I say was the theme? The power and authority of Jesus. So he doesn't need, you say, well, was it crowded that day? Did they have to take the roof off? But you notice in Mark, it's an act of faith. It's one of the acts of faith that is praised in Mark. And he almost never praises anything, but he does praise that. Jesus saw their faith. That's why the guy's healed,
Mhm.
not because of Jesus' power. I mean, Jesus could do magic tricks, I guess, in Mark. That's okay. He walks on water, but that's not the point of that story. The point of the story is, and not even that he has authority. He says, well, look, that you may know I have authority, but he saw their faith. Well, Matthew
Mhm.
just wants to emphasize the authority and power, and he does that every time. He does that. And the secret basically disappears. Like,
Yeah.
why would you
Yeah.
tell people not to tell what I did or what I said, and why would you give all these secret interpretations? Matthew just goes ahead and puts them out there. So you get so much more out of them on every level if you'll read them like we're suggesting. And then you can still work out
Yeah.
your own beliefs and your own conclusions. But first of all, you're going to be interesting. And did you notice that line I put in the description, Derek, right at the end? And besides, this is more interesting.
Yeah.
Think about it. Don't you
Always,
like things that are
always.
interesting? I don't want to hear somebody jumble everything up and just tell me something that they created. That's not interesting. I want to see if Matthew took something out, or if he added something, or if he multiplied something with. I want to know that.
And that's
So-
actually to the donkey point, Kipp, is that we've been looking at this. There are various scholars. Of course, Kipp's done more reading of some of the articles and commentaries from various scholars than I've had time to even do. But there was an interesting observation. I called our friend Stephen the other day, who's like an avid Greek and source. Yeah. He's like a scholar in his own right, autodidact on this stuff. And I said, there's that weird spot where Jesus is before Pilate, and there's Barabbas, and then there's Jesus in Mark, and it does not call him Jesus Barabbas. There's no early sources that call him Jesus Barabbas. Matthew inserts the name Jesus Barabbas, which just means, Jesus, son of the Father. It's a pun on the word, it seems, where they take and add the name Jesus, and then you have another son of the Father, Jesus the Christ, being like compared in a way. And he does something very interesting, clever, I think brilliant literary move to compare these two, one an insurrectionist and the other being a Messiah figure.
And he knows what he's doing. And he has those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And only Matthew has that. Only Matthew. So we know his point. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And then you look at the two demoniacs instead of one.
Two demoniacs, two donkeys, two Jesuses.
Right. So we wondered if you were on board with thinking, I don't know, I'm going to let Kipp take it from here, because I know you get into wondering if Matthew, how acquainted with the Hebrew. It looks like he's using the Septuagint when he's quoting. Go ahead.
Well, I've leaned towards, I watched Bart do that thing with you, and I've leaned towards towards the Hebrew parallelism, but I'm open to the other view as well, that he is fully, and he's not just stupid and doesn't know that. He's actually trying to play this double thing again. So
what do you
I'd
think,
love
Kipp?
to hear what Kipp, he's been doing reading. What did Allison say? Can I ask you? Or you tell me, what did Allison say?
No, you go, Derek, about Allison. And we're,
because I thought you called him and asked him, right?
I did, and he wasn't.
He was grumpy. No, he was. He said he was in a bad mood.
Putting together bibliography.
Yeah, he's putting some crazy bibliography together. But long story short, he didn't think that he made a mistake. He thinks it was purposeful, and that there's good other sources to possibly rely on to give the reason why rabbis would dual or double up things.
Yeah.
So he thinks he does know Hebrew parallelism, but he thinks that apologists are completely wackadoodle in thinking that there had to be two donkeys, even in Mark, even though it only mentions one. Like, they're trying to harmonize these two texts and not let Matthew just be Matthew, which our good friend Stephen, who is an apologist, went on record. I was shocked to hear him at least consider it, which is a big step. Remember what happened to Mike Lacona when he said the zombie apocalypse allegory? Oh, he got fired.
Well, zombie apocalypse is another dual. Notice when he dies, you have a resurrection. And then when the tomb is empty, you have a resurrection. So it kind of it's proleptically looking at the final resurrection when all the saints rise and appear. Almost to say, hey, don't give up on the parousia. I know it's taken a long time. Matthew has 3 parables of delay added to the Apocalypse chapter in 24. 3 parables of delay. Remember? The guy takes a long time. Remember? And the wicked servant goes, oh, the master's delayed, and I'm going to start acting up and so forth. So I think that's double too, on purpose. How many other doubles? There's probably others we haven't noticed.
Exactly.
All over the place, right?
Yeah, I'd like to see that. But yeah, that Allison just gave his off the cuff. I think the nerdy question that Kipp has more is into literally the specifics. And I want to let you do that, Kipp, because you found some evidence that I don't think is being considered by our friend Stephen, for example, about what's going on and why that last sentence changed in Matthew's retelling of Zechariah 9:9.
Well, I think it's important at the outset. The reason I got into this was because, the apologists in the first place insisting that that there was always two donkeys there, and then this further insistence that well, I mean, there's a couple of things. There's this further insistence that that Matthew had to know his Hebrew and knew it well because of how he handles the quotation from Zechariah 9:9. And there's certainly an argument to be made there, just because in that last line, and people can go back and watch the video that I did about this, where I unpack this in some pretty great detail. But there's certainly an argument to be made there that that last line of the text looks like it reflects something closer to the existing Hebrew text that we have. So I don't know. Maybe Matthew was conversant with the Hebrew in some respect. One thing that I don't buy is this idea that he had, like a Septuagint version of Zechariah in front of him, and he's copying it literally quite rigidly. It's verbatim, and then he gets to the last line and he's like, no, I don't think so, and rummages around and pulls out his scroll of the minor prophets and rolls it open, his Hebrew scroll of the minor prophets, and rolls it open to Zechariah 9:9, and says, I'm going to actually just translate that last line from here directly. I think that's not what's going on. And importantly, we just don't know.
Right.
But there's many ways to work through this question, and one of them in particular is the recognition, and this is something that I think Professor Emmanuel Tove has brought out with some excellent clarity. When it comes to the texts of the Bible in the Second Temple period at the time of Jesus, one of the things that we see in particular from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we do have scraps of a couple of other manuscripts kicking around as well, is that there was no fixed version, right? We have varieties of these things floating around. And interestingly enough, so the Septuagint text, the one that we have published, the one I have up on my shelf, this is an eclectic text. So it's compiled from a variety of different Septuagint manuscripts. Interestingly enough, there's a whole bunch of them that look really different from one another. We have Greek translations of the Bible at Qumran. A small handful of these these Greek translations, and one of the things that we see with some consistency there, and this matches also with a very important Greek manuscript that was discovered at Nachal Hever, called the Greek Minor Prophet Scroll. One of the things we see there is a text type, a Greek translation of the text that's actually straining to get closer to the Hebrew text. So, and this seems to be a thing, right? This seems to be a thing that people were doing in the first century. So,
yeah,
for all we know, Matthew's just got a version of Zechariah written in Greek that is just doing what all these other Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible are doing, where they're straining to provide something of a more wooden, more literal. Did my wife just come home? I hear the dog biting. I don't think so. So, yeah. So that but where I land on this is, I think the question of whether or not Matthew knew Hebrew, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't think it's all that significant. The question of whether or not he understood Hebrew parallelism, whether he did or he didn't, I think it doesn't seem to make a big difference for him when it comes to this text. Again, it's one of those open questions. The things of significant are that Matthew's got to get 2 donkeys into this story. That's the really important thing here. And I think this is also significant because based on a plain reading of the text, and especially if you're going to treat the source critical question seriously, if you're going to look at what Matthew's doing with this story relative to what Mark does, and Matthew is reading Mark and then making these changes to Mark, it also seems to be pretty important that Jesus is sitting on both of them. I cannot escape that. There's an argument that the pronoun there where it says Jesus, they set their cloaks on them, speaking of the donkeys in Matthew's version, and he sat on them. The apologetic argument goes here, well, we don't know, could it be the donkey, could it be the donkeys, could it be the cloaks? Well, if you look at that passage compared to Mark, it makes it pretty clear that Jesus is sitting on donkeys. And I just think, I've had this discussion a number of times now with various people because it keeps coming up, Derek, and I blame you for that. I blame Paulogia for that too, but all you guys are to blame for this. It's taken over my life. But anyways, I just think that when it comes to Matthew, right? I'm not sure because people are like, well, if he's sitting on 2 donkeys, that just doesn't make any sense. Use some common sense here. Of course, he can't be sitting on 2 donkeys. And at this point, I'm just like, I'm not sure Matthew even cares about whether or not this makes practical sense. I just don't know if that's his motivation here.
To make a historical, is that?
I don't think he is.
Like we start with the wrong assumptions.
I think he's unbothered by the optics of this.
Yeah.
But
let me jump in from Mark's standpoint. As I mentioned earlier, everybody has the text in their heads. So because Matthew adds the quotation from Zechariah 9:9, lo, your king comes to you, and so forth, humble, triumphant and humble, riding on the ass, and so forth. Mark doesn't have that at all.
Nope.
He's got his motif of go into the village and you'll see this. And then that's going to lead to something important happening. He does it for the Last Supper. Go into the village and you'll see a man carrying a jug of water. Follow him. So it's the same motif. So they're at Bethany on the backside of the Mount of Olives. If you've been to Jerusalem, and some of you have, you'll know that when you come down the Mount of Olives from Bethany, you will end up pretty near the Gihon Spring. And then you go up and you go probably into the southern gate. That eastern gate is disputed, but clearly that's not the way you enter the temple. You go through what's called the Hulda Gate, means the mouse gate. It's these tunnels. And I'm not suggesting he rode the donkey a hole into the tunnels and up the steps, but to that point where you would dismount. I think if you look at what the crowd says, it becomes very interesting. They don't say, behold, your king comes to you. They say, blessed is the kingdom that is coming of our father David. Now, why would they say that? In others, Matthew's the one that says, oh, wait, I got a text. Just like the virgin shall conceive, or the young woman, just like out of Egypt, I've called my son. To him, it triggers, oh, maybe this is Zechariah, because Mark is his source. So what is Mark's source? Mark's source, I'll read it to you, I think, is 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 38. And what it says is that Nathan the prophet puts Solomon on a donkey and takes him down to the foot of the Mount of Olives and declares him king. Okay?
Yeah.
That's 1 Kings. So Mark's not even thinking of Zechariah 9. Because he doesn't say, behold, your king comes to you. you yell Hosanna, meaning the kingdom of our father David has now been restored. There's for the first time since the exile, you've got a Davidic figure, according to Mark, riding down on a colt to the Gihon Spring, and everybody's saying, hey, the king, the king. It's a repeat of the coronation of Solomon, who succeeded David. Now we have a new Solomon who's going to succeed David. And for Mark, he's going to build a new temple. Remember, he doesn't care about that old temple going down.
That's
so
right.
Mark has a totally different agenda, nothing to do with Zechariah. So the other thing that harmonist, what are they called? Harmonizers. The other mistake they're making is you're now reading Mark in the light of Zechariah 9 because Matthew added it. Don't do that. You might miss the point of Mark's story, that it's a repeat of Solomon. You see? And that's the only time we know of a king riding a donkey and getting anointed as king at the foot of the Mount of Olives. Just go down to the foot of Mount of Olives today. I've walked it many times. You're at the base of the Gihon Spring, and then you walk back up to the temple. So
I think Allison said when I went to do the recording on the quest for the historical Jesus that we did our course, and many people who watch Myth Vision, they think that the aim of the course is like, we're looking for Jesus. They don't get it. No, it is literally an entire course about the history of scholarship from the Protestant Reformation forward and what happened from David Friedrich Strauss to some of the amazing scholars. And he mentions his he gets agitated by harmonizers and said, for centuries now, they have been defeated. So like, it's almost like when Christian apologists will make these arguments about the Exodus, or they make these particular arguments that want to give, like, as it says, every single thing exactly verbatim is what happened kind of thing, instead of having nuance, flexibility, these kind of things, and saying, look, you're dealing with narrative, maybe mixed with memory of something,
here's a preliminary that any believing Christian can maybe follow. This would be my advice to my students in my classes. Like when I teach the Jesus course, I just know, because of the demographics, I've taught for 30 years in Charlotte, that about 70% are believing, sincere, devout Christians wanting to learn more about Jesus. What I say to them is, let's take a step back from that, because that's not what we're doing. I'm in a state university. It's not a theology course. We're not in a seminary. I'll tell you something that could benefit you more. Hold the beliefs however you want, but let's ask not the question, did it happen, but what is the author of the text intending you to understand? Okay? If you change the question, then the next question could be, if you want to go there, oh, now I see what Mark's doing. Now I see what Matthew's doing. Mm-hmm. He makes it pretty clear, Zechariah 9. Let's see what Luke does. Now, most people, I didn't know. You got to have your text open. I got my Throckmorton here. Luke does not put Zechariah in. He basically, like we saw before, sticks with Mark because it doesn't make a lot of sense to him. And also, I think he does know Matthew. I personally think he's aware of Matthew. He seems to say, well, that is kind of cool. Blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord. So it actually says, blessed is the king rather than blessed is the kingdom. So he might be influenced. Well, I want students to recognize all of that. And if your question is, I don't want to be insulting, but so elementary, remember, it's elementary, dear Watson. If your question is so elementary that all you want to know, I want to know what happened that day. I want a videotape of what happened. Well, first of all, you're not going to have it. And secondly, you're going to lose all the texts that we do have. Why not treasure what we do have first? And if you want to then ask, was it one animal or two or whatever, I see that as a side question, a subsidiary question. If I was talking to any apologist, I would say, reading Matthew's story, what's the point of the story told that way? Reading Mark's story, what's the point? Reading Luke's story. And then you could try to put them all together. You know, we later had people trying to harmonize the Gospels, trying to put them in columns, trying to make it one voice. But why not respect the fact that we have several voices and don't interrupt? Like if I'm talking Mark, don't interrupt me. I'm talking Mark.
Yep.
And I won't interrupt you because it's not about what happened. You know, you say, oh, you think it didn't happen. Doesn't matter if I think it didn't happen. Let's take walking on the water. Does Mark have walking on the water? Yes. I think it's chapter 6. Okay. Did that happen, Dr. Tabor? Here's what I would say. We could discuss that if you wanted, but that's a metaphysical question. It involves Hellenistic divine men and all kinds of other things. Why don't we discuss where it is in Mark? Well, how does he tell it? How does he introduce it? And what's the result? And actually, it turns out that those miracles are negative in Mark. You know how to get fooled about Jesus in Mark? Get excited about the miracles.
Yeah.
That's what the disciples did. And guess what? They never understood. And if you're the reader and you don't get that, you're falling into the trap that the disciples fell. Whoa, he walked on the water. He calmed the storm. Oh, he's Christ. And
he gets angry.
Exactly what he didn't want you to say. He said, remember making the loaves? They have 2 loaves. And he goes, don't you remember I can make 5,000 loaves right now and sink the boat with loaves? But is that the point? What about the leaven of the Pharisees that I told you don't want to eat in your bread? And they're like, we don't even have bread. What do you mean? You see, that's most people. I just want to know if he walked on water, Brother Tabor. Well, where is it in Mark? If you don't know where it is in Mark, you haven't studied Mark. You got to know the chapter. So that's a good. I only have 12.
Well, we should probably go with some super chat.
Yeah. And look, James, just so everybody knows, when James bounces out, if you and me, Kipp, want to polish
I
up,
can continue for.
And do you have
bit.
super chats we need to address that apply to this, or are you just going to do them later, or what?
I'm going to ask them now, and then what we'll do is me and Kipp can freestyle a little longer once you're gone, James, just to touch on a few interesting things and emphasize stuff. Because initially, just so everybody knows, so you don't walk away from the stream feeling a little bit criticized, this was initially going to just be James. And then it was like, let's bring Kipp in to hang out with James and talk about these things. So
I like hanging out.
Yeah. But this was initially going to be just having Dr.
The thing is, all of us that work in the field, we really agree with these basic methods. And where we may disagree is what final conclusions we draw from them. Like, but let's say we're going to do Mark's empty tomb. I think Kipp and I and Allison and Bart, everybody would agree on the basics of what Mark probably is trying to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you want to say, was that historical? Was it not? That's sort of like a second level of inquiry. And I tend to try to keep students, put your nose in the text first. And then, you'll have a lot of time to ask those bigger questions as well.
Awesome. Salama 510, thank you for the super chat. Thanks all. Could you talk about the Greek Matthew versus the Hebrew Matthew sayings? Greek Matthew, is it possible later interpolations after the revolts?
Okay, well, there are 3 Hebrew Matthews. Mostly people are referring to what's called Evan Bohan. It was written by a rabbi, or preserved by a rabbi from, I think, the 1500s, 1400s, that George Howard published, but there are a couple of others as well, Dutilat and so forth. I've studied Howard's text quite a bit. And he argued that version did not come from the Greek. He got in a lot of hot water, but in his second edition, he addresses his critics. And I think he might have a point that it's some version that is circulated in Hebrew, passed along by rabbis along the way. And it's not, we extract Matthew. It's not like there's a copy of Matthew that rabbis walked around with, this is our Matthew. But he's aware of a copy and he puts it into this treatise that means the smooth stone, the honing stone, Evan Bohan. And he wants to then address it from a polemical point of view. They were having debates at this time in Spain about whether a rabbi and a Christian, remember Pablo Christianus and Rabbi Nachman had a big debate that's recorded for us, not on tape recorder, but stenography. It's pretty interesting to read, called The Disputation. You can get it in print. It's very interesting. So I think Hebrew Matthew, you got to always read it with that in mind. But Howard did point out that it does, for example, it likes the Trinitarian formula for baptism at the end, doesn't have it. It agrees many times with Luke's Q, not Matthew's Q, things like that. So it does seem to be a different text. I wouldn't say, the Greek is better than Hebrew Matthew or Hebrew Matthew. A lot of people, they get all into, it's Hebrew Matthew, then this must be the original, because there's some legend. What is it in Papias? Is that in Papias where he wrote in Hebrew?
Yeah.
But that's the Logia. I don't think it's the Gospel of Matthew from what I can figure out. But anyway, I think it's worth reading. If you go to my website, jamestabor.com, and write in Hebrew Matthew as a search term, you'll get some good analysis of it that I've offered. Also have a video of it that I gave at a bar conference. But usually when people get all excited about Hebrew Matthew, they're thinking it's going to replace the Greek. And I don't really think it can do that. So it's like Kipp mentioned earlier in terms of other versions of the Septuagint. We have papyri, Greek papyri found in Egypt, that don't agree exactly with our sayings in the canonical Gospels, but they are sayings of Jesus. Some of them are similar. We got the Gospel of Thomas. To me, I want it all. I want every scrap of evidence on every text. Put them side by side and discuss them. But I don't think there's any one you can say, this is the one. And again, that's scholarship. You've got to compare textual variants as well. Same thing.
Thank you. From Kipp Davis's YouTube channel, Jason Rowland says the Sabbath made for man passage is prototypical example of the argument from Aramaic. I'd be interested in more discussion of that argument.
I'll leave that to Kipp.
Yeah. Okay. So that is which one is that? That's Matthew.
Picking grain on the Sabbath. Mark.
Yeah, that's it, right?
Mark 2, Matthew 12, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. There we go. So this is something that I know Maurice Casey has written on this. Bart Ehrman has picked this up in some of his work. The idea behind this is that at a minimum, there seems to be maybe an Aramaic core of traditions or ideas or sayings floating around, and we can maybe tease out some of those on the basis of how a number of these texts reads. And this is one of those examples where in Mark, it says, I'm just looking here, it says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. Well, if this was an Aramaic saying, the word for man in Aramaic is just, it's just bar enosh. It's just son of man, right?
It means human being. Yeah,
human being. So and it's exactly as James suggested. Mark's understanding of this this story is that that Sabbath was made for human beings, and that's the point. The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's just saying that
Human beings, yeah,
the human being
exactly.
is the Lord of the Sabbath. But that's something that only comes out if this is a saying that originated within an Aramaic context.
Right. And if
And
you,
I personally think it's a pretty good argument.
I do too. In Daniel 7:14, 13
Yeah.
and 14, very important as well for that same reason, because every Christian tends to jump to some kind of Christological interpretation. This is Jesus coming before the Father and receiving power and glory and so forth. And it is Bar Enosh. I saw a video just came up on my screen and I was finding out what Derek's doing lately. And it was something about, how all the critics are saying that's not Jesus and it's really Jesus. So apparently the apologists are arguing that it's Jesus. Well, it's
always
not Jesus in Daniel, not because I don't believe in Jesus. It's just not Jesus, because it's later interpreted as the saints of the Most High, meaning human beings. And the idea is that a group of human beings will receive heavenly exaltation or power. Let's just call it heavenly power. To them is given authority and power to rule all the nations. It's a common kind of messianic theme. But it's not about a Messiah, Davidic figure. It's about the people of God. And that would be very parallel to this. So who's Lord of the Sabbath? You're Lord of the Sabbath. Are you a human being? Are you made in the image of God? Genesis 1. So that's what he's saying. It's actually a funny exegesis of Genesis 2, verse 1 and 2, right? He rested on the Sabbath and blessed it and said, so it was made for humans. Yeah. Who did he bless it for? He blessed it for humans. Presumably God wasn't that tired. But he blessed it for humans and made it holy, made it special for humans. So that's all he's saying. That's a good point, Jason, that you brought that out. Thank you.
Jason's bright.
Salama's back. Matthew seems to tame Mark's Jesus and the Q Jesus, in a way taming Paul, Mark, and maybe Q, who reflects earlier radicals. Greek Matthew, the tamer.
Yeah, depending on the use of tame. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Eric Wander, thank you for becoming a member of Kipp Davis's Heaven.
Oh, yay.
Yeah.
I just started channel memberships, people. So
okay.
Exciting.
Yeah, so that
I know I've like 2. That's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing that. Salama's back. I can see how Mark's secret gospel and the ending would create all this interest in creating other gospels. The way Game of Thrones fans want to rewrite the ending and create their own endings.
Yeah,
that is true.
Yeah,
that show pissed me off when it ended the way it did.
Oh my God! Yes,
it's tragic. It's literally like another tragedy. That's
literally. And one thing to point out about Mark's secret Mark, I'm talking the Morton Smith text from Clement of Alexandria. There are 2 levels of discussion. You can read the Atlantic article that's out in the current issue. I subscribe, but I think it's behind a paywall, but I think it's going to be released soon. Usually they put it in a paywall for a week, so you'll be able to read it. But the thing people forget about it is, first of all, it's, if you thought it was an authentic letter of Clement, and he's authentically, or a copy, I should say, and he's authentically quoting what the Carpocratians have in 2 places. And he's saying, oh, when you come to Jericho, there's actually this. And then when you come to the garden, there's this. That has nothing to do with whether Greek Mark should have those passages or not. And Morton Smith, I knew him well. He did not argue that. He did not argue that Greek Matthew, you need to go put that in. What he argued is that behind the scenes, so to speak, of canonical Mark, there are alternative traditions about these baptismal rites, if it is baptism, and he thought it was. And they had to do with the nakedness that Jonathan Smith developed in his wonderful article called Garments Without Shame, where he finds it even in the prayer of Joseph, which is a very important, and it talks about trampling your old clothes, going down into the water and coming up with new clothes. Clothed, Paul uses that analogy. So it actually is part of a possible Pauline leaning tradition of naked baptism that would be like naked mikvah. But the idea of trampling your old clothes, that's symbolic. It's part of the ritual. So you strip down naked, you trample your clothes, you go into the water, and you come back up. And you say, well, that sounds kind of erotic. Well, I mean, Smith might have taken it that way personally, but if you look at his big book, his Harvard book, Clement of Alexander and a Secret Gospel of Mark, he really isn't getting into that as much as a mystery religion that would have this ritual initiation of some type. And I think Paul has that. I think you find it in Romans. When you go down into the water, you're buried with Christ. And I think, Mark has nothing about baptism except John's baptism. That's it. So secret Mark, so-called, doesn't mean it belongs in canonical Mark, but it's a later tradition that does develop. So
Thank you. Thank you.
mhm.
Dr. Romana says in Mark, when Jesus is asked if he is the Messiah and responds with ego e me, why do you think Matthew Luke made the response even more ambiguous? The definitive response belies the secrecy motif.
Because in Mark, the secret is out. The secret is actually out when he rides the donkey down the hill. Because you now are proclaiming that the kingdom has arrived. And then he goes up and he pantomimes cleaning the temple of traitors, Zechariah 14, last verse. In that day, there'll be no traitors in the house of the Lord. And stop sacrifice, which is Jeremiah 7. So what Mark's doing is saying, hey, he fulfilled 3 texts. Like Solomon, he went to the Gihon on a donkey and was proclaimed king. Then, like Zechariah's prophecy, there'll be no traitor in the house of the Lord in that day. And like Jeremiah, he condemned the rapacious sacrifice where they turned it into a house of slaughter and commerce. And so these are all prophetic acts. And once that happens, the word is out. There's no secret anymore. And so for Mark, you just say, yes, I am. So why did Matthew and Luke make it more like you say it, or I would have to look. What did Luke say? Did he say you say it also? Let me look. But my point is, I think Mark has a singular purpose. There are 2 true confessions of Jesus. Peter's is not a true confession because he doesn't understand the suffering, right? That's inspired by Satan. Sorry about that. We did a couple programs on that. So where are the 2 confessions of who Jesus is? One is from Jesus himself. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Yes, I am. The other is the centurion. And unlike Bart Ehrman and many interpreters, I don't think it's sarcasm. I think it's actually the great confession. You confess the God-forsaken, dead Messiah on the cross. Truly, this is the Son of God. And if you want to follow him, you'll too be a dead messianist on the cross as you take up your cross and follow. That's Mark's message.
Interesting.
So he
It's
wants
a hard one to swallow.
Yeah. So it's not
Right.
sarcasm at all. It's actually the most profound statement in the Gospels. It has nothing to do with the culture, like, oh, but a Roman wouldn't have done that and all. That's not it. Look where he's doing it. He's about to be beaten to death as he says, I am. So I am what? I am the beaten to a pulp Messiah. And he was what? The dead, God-forsaken Messiah. You still want to follow? Mark's basic. You still want to follow? Have at it. But if you turn that into triumph, glory, hallelujah, I think that's what Mark's worried about. See, in the 2nd century, people are jumping on the bandwagon and they're saying, we got this new thing, man. Hook yourself to Jesus' star and he'll take you to heaven. You know, he's the glory, hallelujah guy. And Mark's saying, whoa, maybe so. But you got to suffer first. And he's getting that from Paul. That is so Pauline, right? When Paul, the greatest chapter of Paul on glory is Romans 8. And what does he say after going through glorified bodies in the cosmos? Provided we suffer with him that we may be glorified with him. And when you say suffer with him, it means like him. So as Bob Dylan said, it ain't me, babe. Very few people are willing, and I'm not saying none are. Dietrich Bonhoeffer did, and I would admire him for that. You know Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who stood in the pulpit, held up Mein Kampf, Hitler's biography. He was supposed to put it on the pulpit. He threw it on the ground and stepped on it and said, this will never be on the pulpit of this church. And
he died in a...
He was arrested promptly by the Gestapo and thrown in prison. And he wrote a book in prison called The Cost of Discipleship. And it opened... I believe
he died in a concentration camp, didn't he? Or in prison?
In prison, yeah. And in the opening line of Cost of Discipleship, which many Christians have read, very simple. When Christ calls a man, a person, he said man, but he meant a person, he calls him to die. And he didn't mean like, yeah, you know, I'm going to give up chewing gum for Lent.
That was my reading of Ignatius. I took a friend of mine who's not aware of Christian theology, and I was explaining many Christians who listen to me describe it. If that's the version of Christianity, no wonder you left Christianity and were harmed by the ideas. Yeah, Ignatius writes to his Roman letter saying, I want to die. I'm asking you, if you love me, don't interfere and make sure that my death happens so that, and he repeats this phrase often, that I may attain to God.
Yes.
That he has an apotheosis.
Paul started this. This is coming from Paul. Isaiah 53 is where a lot of it comes from, but that, when you read it with all of the suffering servant hymns, it's actually a collective call for a faithful remnant to bear up under abuse and suffering from the nations.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And not just the nations, even from the nation of the unfaithful ones. And it's a theme of 2nd Isaiah. And it's very discreet. It's not carried on into 3rd Isaiah, which is glory, hallelujah stuff. And it's very tough to read. But it's not the Lone Ranger doing it. Now, today, here will be my final criticism of people who use this stuff today. You can't sit in a comfortable pew with your Mercedes and your BMW out front on Easter morning and follow Mark and then go to lunch. You can't do that. Now, where it does come out is leave everything you have and give it to me, meaning the preacher and the church. If anybody wants to do that, that's fine. I'm being sarcastic, but you get the idea. You know, somebody says,
that's why
I think I'm going to sell my house and my car. Yeah, you got
make our own.
You got a building fund for the church, and I'm not making fun of this. I grew up in it. Okay, so for me, this is real. I don't make fun of things that I don't understand. I make fun of it, I suppose we say make fun, making light of it, because it's so ludicrous. When Peter asks, we've left everything and followed you, what are we going to get? It absolutely, that's in Mark. And Jesus is just like, he just told the guy to give up everything he had and follow. And Peter go, well, we did that. Are we going to get some stuff too? And then what happens? They all forsook him and fled. So that,
A couple. Well, we got some more. I don't know how many.
Yeah, I'm gonna take off, you guys, because I've got a Lori's home, my wife, at 4:30, and I've got to help her with some things. So this is great, though. Thank you, Derek, for doing this, and Kipp.
Thank you.
And I hope it
Yeah,
helps
good to see you,
people.
James.
I want to help Bible readers of all sincere levels of approach, sincerity, and everything to just be careful readers of the text. That's it.
Mhm.
And if you want to talk to me more about it, join my classes for the Zoom meetings or my Patreon, where I also meet with people once a month and we talk about all this endlessly. Take care, everybody.